I would like to take the opportunity to introduce Dr Jessie Ricketts from Royal Holloway, University of London, who'll be presenting tonight's webinar.
Thank you very much. Should I take over now? Okay. So I think what we're going to do, so hi there everybody, is start by just introducing myself. So thank you very much to Fraser and for GTCS for having me today. So I'm going to talk primarily about vocabulary and reading development in secondary age pupils. So of course the research I've done is relevant for primary and secondary as well, and tells us some really important things about what we should be doing at all stages of the education system. Before we start, I thought it would be great to just get a sense of who is listening. So I'm just going to set up a couple of polls, so hopefully these will work. I haven't done this before. So let me try this first one. Okay, so it's starting to look a bit stable with the different responses now. So I'll close that poll and I can share that with you. So really good to see that we have about, of people who are working in schools, we have about half primary and secondary, and then some other people joining us today as well. And just got a couple of other things that I'm going to ask now. So if I just launch this poll. Okay, so that's also really interesting to see. So hopefully you can see the results of that poll now. And it's great to see that most of the people listening have at least an okay understanding, and some people very high. So hopefully there will still be something of interest and something new in there for you. And just one final poll then, just to give me a sense of where we're going with this. Okay, you should be receiving that now. Okay, so I'm just going to close and share that one with you. And the results of that poll are particularly interesting for me, as you will see, because partly the reason why I got funding to do some research in secondary was that I increasingly was encountering teachers in secondary schools who had many pupils around who didn't have the kinds of literacy and language skills that they needed to access the curriculum. And what the teachers and other school staff were saying to me was that they didn't have the knowledge or the resources to support those students. So that's partly why I did this research, to try and get a better sense of what the picture is in secondary school, so that we can then start thinking about what we might do to promote language and literacy further. So I'm just going to move on in my slides now. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk a bit about the science of reading to start with, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. I know that there's a lot of knowledge out there in the audience, but I think it's good to make sure we have a shared understanding of the framework that we're working within. And then I'm going to talk about the Vocabulary and Reading in Secondary Schools project, which is a project that I've been working on for some years now, looking at language and literacy in secondary, in Key Stage 3 particularly. And then, oops, sorry about that. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about educational outcomes in secondary pupils. And finally, the role of reading practice, and then give you some resources and further reading for if you're interested in following this up. Okay, so to start then, for some of you this will be a familiar framework, but this is a framework that I do tend to use in my research. So if you start to think about the science of reading and starting to think, therefore, about what underpins reading success in children and indeed in adults, a really good starting place is the simple view of reading. It was initially proposed some decades ago, and the idea is really simple. That's why it's called the simple view. So according to this view, there are two sets of skills that are really important for reading success. So one is word recognition or word reading. So you need to be able to read words to access print and to read, of course. But the other set of skills relates to language comprehension. So of course, just being able to read words successfully and fluently doesn't guarantee reading success. It doesn't guarantee reading for comprehension and reading to learn. So language comprehension skills are also important. And what the simple view of reading suggests is that both of these sets of skills are necessary, and neither is sufficient on its own. So you need to have both of these things in order to be in a good position for reading success. Now, one of the reasons why this view, I find it really useful, is when you put it in multi-dimensional space like this, it helps you to think about the pupils that you might encounter in your classroom, and indeed the students that I might encounter in my university lectures. And so what you can think about is all of the pupils or students as falling somewhere in this multi-dimensional space. Now, typically what happens is you see that these two sets of skills go together. So you have individuals who range from being not so good at reading words and having poor language comprehension down here in the bottom left-hand corner, up to those students who are really good at reading words and text and also really good at language comprehension. So these are our kind of excellent readers. What this view and when presented in this way also highlights is the groups of children who will be experiencing reading difficulties. So I've just mentioned those who have difficulty with word reading and with language comprehension, but there are also two other groups of pupils that we might need to be concerned about. So there are those pupils in the top left-hand corner here who have difficulty reading words and text accurately and fluently, and of course that's the kind of profile that you can see in dyslexia. And then on the flip side of that, you can have children who can read words and text accurately and well, but they have difficulty with comprehension. And those are the kind of poor comprehenders or children with specific reading comprehension difficulties. So that gives you a sense of the kinds of pupils that you might expect to see in your classroom. And that's one of the reasons why the simple view of reading is really useful. It helps us to think about individual differences and variation. Now, we recently published a supplement to the guidance on improving literacy in secondary schools through the Education Endowment Foundation on the simple view of reading. And what we've highlighted there is that it's really useful actually for thinking about assessment, identification of children with reading difficulties, targeting intervention, and also monitoring progress. So in terms of assessment, what it suggests is that we should, at minimum, assess word reading and language comprehension if we want to get a sense of the reading skills of our pupils. In terms of identification, through that kind of assessment, we can identify children who have difficulties in one of those aspects or in both. We can think, therefore, about how to target interventions, so whether they need an intervention that addresses word reading abilities or language comprehension or both, and also if we put those interventions or additional support in place and thinking about monitoring progress in both sets of skills. So the important thing here really is that you can't, reading is not just a kind of unitary construct, which I'm sure is it's not a new idea to you guys. Now what we're going to do is try to generate this word cloud. So if you have a phone next to you, then if you could just grab that phone, I can give you some instructions here. So if you grab the phone, go to www.menti.com and enter the code 170063. And what I would like you to do is to type in the other things beyond word reading and language comprehension that are important for reading. So hopefully that's working and it will start populating soon. Okay, I'm not sure if that's working. Oh yeah, I can see some people engaging with that. So we'll give it a few more minutes. I think I've set it up so that you can put more than one idea into it. So it's really nice at this point always, and I usually do this interactively with a room full of people, so I'm trying to do it at a distance, but it's really nice to get a sense of what you guys think is important for reading, helping us to think about why the simple view of reading might actually be too simple, really. It's a really important framework and really useful, and some of that utility comes from it being simple, but of course there's other things that are important for reading. Okay, now usually it now comes up, and I don't know whether, here we go. Fantastic. Oh, good. It's always really exciting when this works. So I can see loads of really important, interesting ideas there. So we've got vocabulary, which you might argue is part of language comprehension, but also things like enjoyment, motivation, imagination, working memory, world knowledge, background knowledge is really important, context, the amount of reading that you do at home, books that you have at home, cultural tools. So loads of really interesting and important ideas there. And I think when we put these slides up later, we can keep that word cloud. So thank you everybody for contributing to that. Now, of course, in a research project, you can't look at all of those things all at once. So we have focused in on the research that I'm doing on some aspects of that. And before I move on to talk about the Vocabulary Reading in Secondary Schools project, the Ferriss Project, I just thought I'd show you a slightly less simple view. So it's not as obviously intuitive as the simple view, and it contains a little bit more information, but essentially what you can see is the simple view lurking within this reading systems framework. So you have word reading, which is this part of the system, which of course involves turning letters into sounds and accessing the meanings of words and so on. And then you have the language system and comprehension over this side. And it gives you a little bit more of a sense of what we mean by these comprehension processes. So passing information, representing the information within a text in a situation model, developing that model of the text, making inferences and so on. The other thing that this slightly less simple view, this reading systems framework highlights, I think is really important, that came up in your word cloud, is general knowledge. So that is always going to be fantastically important. So when children come to read any text, of course, what they know about the topic within the text is going to have a massive impact on how well they understand that text and whether they can learn from that text. Okay, so before we move on, the other point that I really wanted to make here is that this relationship is a kind of dynamic one. And so, of course, you have language comprehension as underpinning reading abilities and reading success. But then once you can read, reading then feeds back into your language. And this is a point that's been made really nicely and succinctly by Pamela Snow in 2016 and also by Kate Nation recently. In a paper, and I've got some references of these articles at the end because I think they're really useful ones to read. But essentially the idea is that you have language, spoken language, then you learn to read, and then you have this very dynamic reciprocal system that works across spoken and written language. And that's how we then learn on both sides through that reciprocity. And that will come up again in a moment in my predictions. Okay, so moving now on to think about the Vocabulary Reading in Secondary Schools project. So just to start really on why we might focus on adolescents. So the vast majority of research, as you might know, on reading development focuses on children and focuses on primary age children, and indeed focuses on very early stages of reading development. So as children are learning to read words. There's also a vast literature on reading processes in adulthood. And what was really missing from this picture was research that looked at adolescence. So how do we go from being those developing readers who are still getting to grips with reading and reading fluently and reading for comprehension and reading to learn? How do we get from being that kind of reader to being a skilled adult reader? Assuming, of course, that things go really well, and we find that easy, as most of us do, though not all. I was really interested in this in secondary because I think the secondary school system places particular demands on reading. I think it's fair to say that reading is really crucial for access to the curriculum. There's a wide curriculum that we want our pupils to know. We can teach some of that curriculum directly in the classroom, but really getting to grips with that curriculum is going to involve additional reading. And independent reading. And of course, alongside that, we develop these increasing expectations that pupils can read independently in order to learn as they go through the secondary school system, and indeed in the upper primary system as well. And then ultimately, of course, we want to see our pupils achieving really well. And it becomes really important to think about what the barriers might be to not achieving well in exams and in other assessments, and not being able to read the exam questions or any text that you might need to refer to, and indeed not being able to write your answers. Literacy skills more generally can be a really important barrier to exam performance, and I'm going to come back with some evidence on that a little bit later. But there are lots of reasons why we might focus on reading in adolescence. Against this backdrop, actually, as I've said, we don't know very much about what's happening. There are a few studies out there, but really not much, and certainly no studies looking at development within adolescence. There are some studies that look at development of reading throughout childhood and then a bit into adolescence, but not looking at how things change within adolescence, and that's what I was setting out to do in this project. We do know that there are big changes that are happening in the parts of the brain that support reading during adolescence. So that's a really strong hint that there might be some important changes happening at this point. And also some work that I did with a PhD student, Nicola Dawson, showed that there were some really interesting changes happening in adolescence in terms of the way that individuals process the morphology while they were reading. So there is evidence there that there are some important changes happening, and yet very little research looking at what's changing and what's happening. Now, as I mentioned right at the beginning, one of the main motivators for doing this research was talking to teachers and other school staff who said to me that they were faced with many pupils who couldn't read well enough to access the curriculum. And of course, what that means on the ground really is that teachers are dealing with classes where there is wide variation in terms of the reading abilities, and that must present some challenges. The teachers that I spoke to said that they lacked knowledge of the science of reading, so of how children learn to read and how you can support foundational reading skills. So primary teachers seem to have a lot more training and a lot more knowledge around these issues, but secondary teachers were saying, and other school staff were saying, that they really lack this knowledge. Also, at the time, the materials and resources were very limited as well. And what I found a lot of schools were doing was they were using interventions or materials that were developed for very young children and trying to use those with adolescents. That, of course, is not going to be very conducive to that learning. I mean, what you find with adolescents who can't read is that, of course, they've had years and years of failing to learn to read and falling further and further behind their peers in terms of reading. And if you then give them some materials that they think are babyish, that's probably not going to be very motivating. So this was a real challenge that I was encountering. And it is against a backdrop, certainly in England, of spoken language and foundational reading skills being a real emphasis in what we call Key Stage 1, so the first few years of primary school, and then dropping away as time goes on. And with the focus becoming much more about teaching knowledge and so on, which is also really important. But I would argue that supporting these underlying skills is really important too. So in case you needed any convincing that there is an issue about reading in secondary, just to show you a little bit of evidence has come out of PISA assessments, so these international assessments. What these tend to show is that internationally, about 20%, little bit under 20% of adolescents at 15 in the most recent PISA showed reading that is below what we would consider acceptable, really. And I've just given you a couple of examples of some of the activities that they use to assess reading. These are actually examples from the 2009 version of the PISA, but just to give you a sense of what they might be doing. So what this suggests is that there are 15-year-olds who find it difficult to read a simple advertisement or a simple notice, you know, maybe on the tube or on a train or something like that. And so I think that is a real cause for concern. Now, in this study, I mentioned it's called the Vocabulary and Reading in Secondary Schools study. And so the focus is primarily on reading development and reading abilities. So I guess that raises the question really of why I chose to focus particularly on vocabulary. I guess my view was that it's a really good place to start in trying to understand the reading difficulties that we might see in adolescence. And so, of course, what we're talking about here is the lexical part of this system. And you can see here that this relates to the ability to read words, so that part of the simple view of reading, and also to the language comprehension part of the simple view of reading. So it kind of overlaps those two elements there. So, and I think really what I would argue is that it's really core to being able to read and understand text effectively. And indeed, I mean, it makes sense to think about reading as vocabulary knowledge as underpinning reading. So in order to fully understand a text, logically, you need to understand most, if not all, of the words contained within that text. Estimates suggest that we need to understand kind of 80–90% of the words in a text in order to fully understand it, and you know, maybe more. So, of course, vocabulary is going to be really important for reading. One of the other things that I've been looking at in my research is the kind of flip side of that relationship, and so the importance of reading for vocabulary. So once you learn to read and can read text accurately and efficiently, reading, of course, provides really important opportunities to learn new vocabulary. And indeed, there are lots and lots of words that don't really appear in spoken language, that appear in book language. And so reading, of course, is fundamentally important for learning those words that we don't really encounter in everyday speech. So really the point here is that partly the reason why I've chosen vocabulary knowledge to focus on is that you've got this reciprocal relationship between vocabulary and reading, where there's this really important interplay between these two sets of skills. Now, what we can see from the literature with children, from research with children, is that there's really strong evidence for this bi-directional reciprocal relationship between vocabulary and reading. But in adulthood, in adolescence, there's much less evidence. And the evidence suggests that maybe it only flows from vocabulary to reading. So that's initial evidence that was out there before I started this project. So to give you a little bit of information about the Ferriss Project, we followed up around 200 children when they were 12, and then we saw them a year later when they were 13, and then a year after that when they were 14. And we lost a few pupils along the way, but not that many. They're about half and half girls and boys, which is what we would hope to see. So it was a 3-year longitudinal study looking at vocabulary and reading. And what we measured was oral vocabulary knowledge, so what children know about words, how many words they know, but also the depth of their knowledge, so what they know about individual words, so breadth and depth of vocabulary knowledge. We also had a number of measures of word reading ability, so they read words, they read non-words to look at phonics and decoding abilities. And then we had a number of measures of reading comprehension in which they read connected texts silently and then answered open questions about those texts. So we had a range of measures around vocabulary and word reading, and you'll see that those map on quite nicely to the simple view of reading. So we're measuring word reading abilities, we're measuring word comprehension, so language comprehension at the word level, and we're measuring reading success in the sense of reading for comprehension. So what I'm going to show you first is just a sense of what the variation looks like. So from my anecdotal conversations with secondary teachers, I expected there to be wide variation. And indeed, that's what we found. So you can think about this as kind of mapping onto the simple view of reading. And you can see what I said there. So you've got word reading going horizontally and comprehension going vertically, and you can see that there is a kind of correlation, a close association between those two things. So they tend to go together, though there are some children who deviate from that pattern. So those who show specific difficulties reading words and those who show specific difficulties with comprehension. And what's really important, I think, to know, just to kind of put this into context, is that when you look at what those children can actually do who are down in the bottom left quarter, so those children who are struggling with reading, is they look like what you would expect from the average 6 to 9 year old pupil. Okay, so their word reading abilities really are not age appropriate. They're far from age appropriate. And I think what's really important there is that you're expecting someone who's reading a bit like a 6 to 9 year old to use those skills to access a curriculum that's designed for 12, 13 and 14 year olds. And I think that just shows what the gap might be for some of those children. And in real terms, you have 4 or 5 children who are looking like below the average range for word reading. You have about the same number for comprehension. And some of those kids will be overlapping and some won't be. So it just gives you a sense in any class of how many children will be struggling in some way, shape or form with reading. And I think it shows how important it is to just take that into account, as I'm sure you all know. The next set of questions that I was interested in is thinking about, okay, well, we know what the variation looks like in these pupils. What does development look like at this stage? So we know that early on in reading development, so when children are, depends on when they start to read, but 4, 5, 6, 7, in the first few years of reading instruction, development is really rapid. So for most children, they go from not being able to read any words to being able to read short texts accurately and with comprehension in just a few years. So really rapid development, but what we don't really know is what happens later on. And some people have argued to me that things just don't really, nothing's happening from 11 to 14. And I have to admit, I was skeptical about that. And so I asked a set of questions about development. The first question was, is there progress from 12 to 14? And so what you can see here is this is the average performance earlier in time, so at 12, and then you can see average performance in this lighter grey line here later, so we can say that this is 14. So this is just a schematic, but you know, is there an increase over this time? So do we see this kind of pattern? The second question that I was interested in is to do with stability, and this is the idea of kind of pecking order. So is it true that where you are in the pecking order at 12 is very similar to where you are in the pecking order at 14? So that was the second set of questions. Or is there some jostling for position at this point in time? And then the third question that I was interested in is to do with spread. Now, you may have encountered this idea of Matthew effects, which is really the idea that in reading, as in other things, you can see the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. So that's the kind of pattern you can see in the rightmost graph here. So you can see a kind of splaying out of the distribution, with those who were at the top end or doing better kind of gaining ground, if you like, and those who are at the bottom end staying the same or even, you know, falling behind, basically. You can see this variation increasing over time. Now, that's usually what people assume happens with reading, and there is quite a lot of evidence, though it is a little bit mixed, that these Matthew effects are what we see earlier and in childhood. So let's say from age 5 to age 9, something like that. So there is a good amount of evidence that we do see these Matthew effects in reading, though it is a little bit mixed. So the alternatives are, of course, that the distributions remain very consistent. So, you know, the gap just stays the same over time, and that's what you see on the far left. And the middle graph shows a kind of compensatory pattern where you see those who are at the bottom end of the distribution showing some evidence of catching up. So of course that would be the most positive outcome that we might hope to see. So what I've done with the data in order to try and have have a look at the data so that you can see what's happening and see it in the terms that I've just shown you, is I have divided the children into groups. And so I've divided the 200 children into 10 groups. I could have just showed you the individual trajectories, but that would look quite messy and it wouldn't be very clear, but very easy to see what the patterns were. And so you can think of 20 children as contributing to each of these lines. Now at the top, the most faint orange line is the top 10%. So that's the top 10%, say, in the class or in the school. And then the darkest line at the bottom is the bottom 10%. So that's the way to read these graphs. So hopefully that's reasonably clear. So I'm just going to show you one graph for word reading accuracy. So this is the accuracy with which pupils at age 12, 13 and 14 could read a list of words in this particular measure, though we had a range of measures here. And what you can see here, and this the X's mark the average performance, and you can see this kind of bottom 10%, which is a bit removed from the rest of the distribution, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But what you can see here is that there is significant growth. So there is progress. It does look to be quite small, but might still be functionally important, might still actually be really important on the ground in terms of their reading. We do see very high stability. So this pecking order amongst children does seem to be very consistent over time. And most interestingly, we see evidence of a little bit of a gap narrowing effect. So we're not seeing these Matthew effects with the gaps widening over time. We're actually seeing the opposite. And so overall, that's what we see. Now, the pattern was the same for reading comprehension and for vocabulary. So these are just some examples of the different measures that we have. And I guess you can maybe see the pattern most clearly for this vocabulary measure on the bottom right. But what we're seeing is growth. We're seeing stability. We're seeing narrowing, but importantly, not closing of the gaps over time. Now, I said I would come back to this bottom line that looks a bit distant from the rest of the distribution, the rest of the groups of children. And this is these kind of 4 or 5 children per class who are below average on each of these measures. So this is the bottom 10 or so percent. And those are the children who are not really performing above what you would expect of an average 9-year-old, even though they're expected to access the curriculum that's designed for 12, 13, 14-year-olds. Now, the final set of questions that I was asking in this project is, what is the relationship between vocabulary and reading? So we've looked at those things separately, and we've looked at how they develop over time, but what is the relationship between those two things? Now, what we actually found was slightly unexpected, though I think makes a lot of sense. So we didn't find that the existing vocabulary knowledge was what drove development in reading comprehension. We didn't find that it was reading comprehension that drove vocabulary knowledge. Instead, what we found was that those two things were just very, very closely related. And so it was almost impossible to tease those things apart. So it really, really resonates with this idea from Pamela Snow of language is literacy is language, or vocabulary is reading is vocabulary in this case, which is partly why I set the stage with that. Okay, so just to summarize and to think a little bit about what this might mean for the classroom. So we've got this variation, enormous variation, and we've got this kind of poorest performing 10 or 20% who are performing at a level that's not really sufficient to access the curriculum. And I think what this means is that we need to make sure that we acknowledge the challenges that this poses for teachers. So any secondary teacher is going to be faced with this wide variation and is likely going to have children in their classes who really are not, really do not have the skills that they need in that classroom. And so what this suggests to me, given the backdrop of knowing that there isn't, that teachers feel that they don't have sufficient training, secondary teachers feel they don't have sufficient training or resources, is that we need to put those things in place. And we really can't assume that all secondary pupils have the language and literacy skills that they need to access the curriculum. I think that's really important. In terms of development, we saw some progress, and we saw this high stability and evidence of compensation rather than Matthew effects. And so things do change during this period. I mean, it may be that these changes are not enormous, and then certainly not the kinds of changes that we see earlier on in development, but they're still happening. And they may well be functionally important. Now, what's certainly the case in the context where I am is that these foundational abilities, so what children know about words on the whole, and their reading skills are not taught in most classrooms. So it's certainly possible that with more active teaching, like the kind of teaching that we see in the primary setting, we may see more progress than this. And so that's certainly something that we can think about. And of course, pupils are learning a lot of new information, but it might just be that we're not tapping into all of that. Well, of course, we're not tapping into all of that information here with these measures. It's really important to know that we might be able to narrow this gap, but I think a really important bottom line is there's a lot of rhetoric around at the moment about word gaps and closing gaps. And I think probably it's unrealistic to expect that we're going to completely close the gaps, because hopefully what I've shown you is that they're really vast. You know, you're talking about someone who's reading at the level that you would expect of a 6-year-old compared to someone who's reading at adult levels. And I think closing that gap is probably unreasonable. But this is certainly encouraging evidence to suggest that we can narrow those gaps, that they're not getting wider during this adolescent period. And in terms of the relationship between vocabulary and reading, we see that it's inextricably linked. And what that suggests is we need to identify which children have challenges, and we need to identify where those challenges lie. So are they having difficulty reading words? Are they having difficulty understanding text? Are they having difficulty understanding words? And we need to continue to support them and to target interventions towards the things that they are having difficulty with. Okay, so that's the main body of this talk, but I'm just going to touch a little bit on what I've found about educational outcomes, and also hinting at a new project where we're looking at the role of reading practice now. So what we have done more recently is we followed these same pupils up and we got their GCSE grades. So these are the exams that pupils take in England at age 16. And we actually have this cohort took the new GCSEs that have just come in. And so about half of them gave us their GCSE results. And the new GCSEs have these grades that go from U 1, 2, 3, 4 up to 9. And so those correspond to U to A star in the old system. And what I've plotted here is the percentage of our participants who got these different grades in English language, so that's in blue, and English literature, so that's in orange. You can see quite a good distribution here. I do actually have the data for all of the subjects, and all of them did do maths, so I can also analyse those too. But these are really preliminary findings because we're kind of hot off the press at the moment. I think the bottom line in terms of overall performance is that in terms of those who were showing a pass and above, so that's a level 4 and above, the numbers in our cohort were commensurate with what you see nationally in England. So that's my point here. Now, in terms of thinking about their language and literacy skills and how that predicts educational attainment at 16, what we had in this study that is novel and really interesting is we had these measures at age 12 of word reading and reading comprehension and vocabulary. Excuse me. And we also had their educational scores at 16. And what we showed is that their language abilities, and by that I mean vocabulary and reading comprehension all in together, were really strong predictors of how well they did in their GCSE English, in their English exams. And these are the final compulsory exams that kids do in England. Word reading wasn't such a strong predictor, though it will be important for some of the kids there. And I think the really important thing for future researchers is to try and unpick what's going on here. So it may well be that language abilities have a direct influence of how well they do in that moment, in that exam. Of course, in terms of reading and understanding what's expected of them in the exam, and also in terms of producing their answers. But it's also, I think, fair to say, and you know, this is something that we can investigate further, that their language abilities will affect the progress in terms of their curriculum knowledge and therefore their attainment as well. So it's a direct effect in terms of how well they perform in the moment, but also this kind of cumulative effect over time, because your language skills are going to determine how well you can access that curriculum knowledge and learn it over time. So in summary, there is this really interesting finding where these foundational language and literacy abilities are important for exam success. So of course, curriculum knowledge is going to be important, but we also need to think about these foundational skills. And I guess my point is that we're, at the moment in England anyway, we are not supporting those foundational skills in any systematic way. And I think that's what we need to do. So just to take things, to broaden things out a little bit now, to think about a new project that I've just started with colleagues at Aston University. So this is funded by the Nuffield Foundation with Dr. Laura Shapiro and Dr. Sanne van der Kleig at Aston. And what we're interested in here in looking at here is the other things that might be important, and focusing really on reading practice. So how much reading kids are doing. And of course, what we know, and I guess, you know, what we know anecdotally, and also there is evidence, is that kids increasingly read less on the whole as they go up the school system. And this project is really focusing on trying to identify how important the reading practice that they do is for their developing reading skills, and also for learning while they are reading. And so we've put together a kind of schema here which identifies the relationships that we're looking at. So we've got reading ability here on the bottom left of this triangle, and thinking about how that influences reading success later, and also how well they can learn while they're reading, and whether that relationship is direct. So it's just about ability going forward, or whether it's actually mediated. Actually, what's also important is the amount that kids read. And in this project, we are tracking children longitudinally as they transition from the primary setting into the secondary setting, but we're also developing an intervention to try and get adolescents to read more, so that we can look at that relationship in that way too. Okay, so the take-home messages from today then are that foundational language and literacy really matters in secondary school. There is some growth in those things, which is not necessarily what everyone would have expected. I mean, I've certainly had people saying to me, nothing's going on in adolescence, why would you want to look at that? And that's clearly not true. With more input, with more focused teaching, we might see some more progress as well. That's an open question. In terms of GCSEs and attainment, content knowledge is really important, but these foundational language and literacy abilities are going to be potential barriers to success as well, or determinants of success. And the amount that pupils read, we think, is key, but how can we promote this? And that's what we're going on to look at in the Reading and Vocabulary Project. So just to hint, kind of point you in the direction of a few resources, some of which I know we've sent to you, or you can access via this webinar. Definitely worth having a look at this Reading Wars paper if you haven't already. It's quite long, but it's kind of everything that you need to know about reading ever in the world ever paper, and it's definitely worth having a look at. The article in which I'm describing the Ferriss Project, in the way that I've talked about it today, is forthcoming. It should be out in the next month or so in Scientific Studies of Reading, so that reference is here. I've also given you the two references for Pamela Snow's Language is Reading is Language, and Kate Nation's similar ideas as well. And as far as I know, all three of those articles, all four of these articles in fact, are open access, so you should be able to get those readily if you haven't already. And if you have any difficulties, then please do contact me. Now, finally, in terms of resources, in terms of more practical things, I recently advised on some secondary guidance for the Education Endowment Foundation, so definitely worth checking that report out. And there is also an underpinning Simple View of Reading resource that I talked a bit about earlier on. And the AEF Guidance focuses on the following 7 things. So prioritising disciplinary literacy, so the way that literacy manifests across different disciplines, providing targeted vocabulary instruction, developing the ability to read, so developing those foundational skills, breaking down complex writing, so focusing on other aspects of literacy, not just reading, combining writing with reading and seeing the interplay between those two things, providing opportunities for structured talk, and finally, I just need to move my thing, providing high quality literacy interventions. So do check out that guidance if you're interested in some more practical tools. Apologies, I've got a bit of a cough. Okay, so just finally to say thank you to you guys for listening. Thanks to all of the pupils and teachers and schools who were involved. Of course, these projects are also always involve large teams. So here are the other members of the team here. And here are some contact details for if you want to find out more about my research. And there will be some information about the research I've talked about today coming up in the Times Educational Supplement soon. So I think what we're going to do now is have some questions, and we've certainly got a bit of time for that.
Hi, Jessie.
Hi.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Yeah, just to remind people, if at any point you want to submit questions now, as we're going to move on to the Q&A session, you can do so through the questions tab in the control panel at the side. If we don't get around to any of these today, we can contact you in the future with the answers to that. Another little reminder that the handouts that Jessie mentioned during those last couple of slides, 3 of those are available through the control panel as well, so you can download them at the moment. Going to just ask a couple of questions that have been submitted just now to you, Jessie. We've got one here, which is, what approaches would you suggest to narrow the gap between high and low performers in reading and vocabulary?
Yeah, so that's a really, really important question. And I think there are a couple of things that you need to think about. So the first step would be perhaps to use the simple view of reading and think about the 2 things that are suggested there. So it might be that these children at the bottom need work on word reading, and you can find out about that through assessment. So that would be a first port of call. And then they also might need additional support in terms of language comprehension, perhaps teaching some vocabulary. So you can use the simple view of reading as a framework for starting to think about which strategies you might employ. Now, in terms of an evidence base for interventions that work in secondary, we're a bit thin on the ground at the moment. So things are starting to develop, which is really encouraging. I think what I can say quite wholeheartedly is that what we can't do is just take the interventions that we know work in primary school, where we have much more evidence, and lift those and put them into the secondary setting. Because actually, I think once you fast forward 4 or 5 years down the line, what you find is that there are other challenges that you need to address, such as poor self-esteem and efficacy to do with reading. So we might need to use some quite different approaches. So I think on balance, I would say that the same ideas apply. So you might want to think about promoting the ability to read words and also promoting vocabulary knowledge and being able to do inferences, make inferences, and being able to monitor what you're reading and look back strategies and all of those things that we know work in primary school. But we need to put that within the context of thinking about adolescent readers and what might be different about them. And I think that's where the intervention research needs to go next. What I was trying to do with this research is give an outline of what the situation looks like so that then we can build on that situation. But yeah, really nice question. Thank you.
Okay, we've got another question here. How are you planning to promote reading practice in your new project?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. So we're doing something a little bit unusual. I think what we felt was that, much like I've just said, really, we can't expect, we might need to use something quite innovative to get adolescents to read, because they really don't seem to want to read for many different reasons. So what we've decided to do is take inspiration from the behavioural change literature. And what has been found there with adolescents, and particularly with some hard to reach adolescents, is that if you want to change healthy eating behavior, for example, you can set up a kind of system of getting adolescents to set goals and interacting with them to see if they're meeting their goals on a daily basis. So it would be perhaps in relation to eating their 5 a day or something on healthy eating, and monitoring things as they go along and giving them opportunities to change their goals and reassess their goals, and also giving them feedback, positive feedback about what they're doing. Now, that's been used really successfully with adolescents in terms of promoting healthy eating. And so what we did is we took a similar kind of package, and we are going to be applying that to reading. And so it's got these same components of setting goals about how much they're going to be reading. So we're going to be giving them some books. We're working with Oxford University Press on this project. We're going to be giving them some books and asking them to read those books. They are books that we're pretty sure will be attractive to them, though that's always quite hard to gauge. Of course, that's going to be really important. And then we will be interacting with them via their phones and text messaging to allow them to set goals and assess their goals and giving them feedback, positive feedback and so on. So that's what we're going to do. It's a little bit unusual and a bit left field, but I think we're really encouraged that it might work because it has worked so well with healthy eating, which may seem like quite a different thing, but actually shares a lot of features with reading behaviour.
Okay, thank you, Jessie. Just ask a question here that's been submitted by Kate Barber. How do we assess word reading and language comprehension?
Oh, that's a great question. Word reading, you might want to consider, if you just wanted to have one word reading assessment, then with adolescents, you might want to consider a kind of fluency measure, like the test of word reading efficiency. That's what I tend to use, very quick. But essentially what we might want to know is how accurate they are in reading words and how fluent they are at reading words, but also how accurately kids can read connected text, so not just individual words, and how fluently they can do that. Now, of course, accuracy is going to be really important because if they can't access the print, then they're definitely not going to be able to access meaning. But fluency is also really important because what we want is for them to be accessing that print kind of really easily, so that they've got plenty of cognitive resources still there, so that they can do the much more complicated stuff of accessing all the meanings and putting them all together and building this mental representation of the text that they're going to need to fully understand it. In terms of language comprehension, the measures that I used for measuring vocabulary knowledge were a measure of vocabulary breadth. So it was just, this is which word is threatening, and you might have 4 pictures and they have to choose the right picture. And then I also used measures of vocabulary breadth. So you might use an expressive measure where you ask, what does police mean? And then you can gauge how much they know about police. So do they have a very simplistic understanding of that word, or do they understand fully what that word means? And indeed, you might go on to see, can they use it in a sentence, and so on and so forth. More broadly, it's really important also, if we want to get a really full sense of language comprehension abilities, to think about grammatical knowledge as well, and you also might want to look at higher level processes like the ability to make inferences and so on. So there isn't a quick and easy way of measuring those things, is the answer, but a really good proxy for both of those things would be to look at word level reading ability and to look at word level knowledge, so vocabulary knowledge.
Okay, thank you, Jessie. Got a question here from Gail Sterling. Have you had experience of increased engagement with secondary pupils when the benefits are explained to them? For example, extra work on decoding to demystify the process.
That's a really interesting question. That's not one that I've looked at in my research in any detail, but we will get some feedback on that when we're working with the pupils to try and get them to read a bit more. So that's a bit of a watch this space one. One of the things we will do with them is we will give them a leaflet at the beginning of the study, so this will be in January, about what the benefits of reading are. And that will be one of the really important things that we do to try and motivate them to set realistic but ambitious goals to look at reading.
Okay, thank you. There's a question here from Jude Durnan. How can we address the skills gap in secondary teachers?
Yeah, that's an important question as well. I think there are a number of different answers to that. I think there are benefits of having resources available online, which is partly why I highlighted those Education Endowment Foundation resources, because those are ones that are easily accessible, that teachers can have a look at their own leisure and so on. And there's lots of practical tips in those, which of course I don't have a background in teaching, but the people who develop those guidance reports do, and so they're much more focused on practical tips. I think also, you know, webinars like this, where it's about upskilling teachers, and what I do in my own practice is I spend a lot of time talking to teachers. So, I mean, like today I'm talking at you a little bit, but usually that's not the way that I operate. So I might say some stuff about my research, and then teachers will tell me about what that might mean for their practice. And it's very much this iterative relationship, so that we can make sure that the research evidence fits what teachers want to know. But I think a really good mixture of having written resources available alongside kind of workshops where teachers can be empowered to build on the very extensive knowledge that they already have, to extend it to some of these things and how they might work in the secondary context.
Okay, thank you. This question here from Emma Horton. Is this issue with reading in adolescence an issue only within the UK?
No, I can't imagine it is. What I would say, I've said this a few times, that the evidence is really thin on the ground. There's some evidence in the States. They don't have the kind of evidence that I presented to you, where you look at development within adolescence, but the evidence that is out there is consistent with what I found. So evidence certainly that these kinds of patterns exist in the States. And I guess what's really interesting there is that teaching strategies are really different in England and Scotland, as they're really different between England and Scotland and the US. So the fact that you find similar patterns across the US and England suggests that those patterns are there to some extent, at least, irrespective of the precise teaching that's happening. Whether this is happening in other languages is an open question at the moment. However, I don't think there's any reason to expect it not to be the case. And I really look forward to seeing those kinds of studies that look at this longitudinally in other languages and other contexts.
Thank you. We'll just ask one last question in this Q&A section. As I mentioned previously, those questions we didn't get around to, we'll publish on the GTCS website as a question and answer there. So this last question is from Michelle Luciano. They ask, are vocabulary and comprehension simply indicators of general cognitive ability? How important is IQ to reading and intervention?
That's a really interesting question, and there's many, many different answers to that question. I think these things are correlated. It depends a little bit on what you think IQ is. I would say that what I'm interested in and what I'm looking at is more fluid abilities and amounts of knowledge that change over time and that we can actually have some input on. Some people would argue that IQ is a much more static thing that we can't really change, that's more resistant to change. I don't see any reason why the things that I've been talking about today are resistant to change. I think they're absolutely malleable. We just need to have the right tools in order to change them. So I guess that's the important bit of that question for me. Though it's a really large question, I could probably write essays on that one.
Okay, Jessie, thanks very much for that. I believe you've got a couple of polls you'd like to do in closing to today's...
Yes, I do. Yes, thank you for reminding me. Okay, so let me just get up this next poll. Okay, so hopefully that's coming to you now. Okay, fantastic. So I can close that and share that with you. It's really great to see that, because of course I asked that question beforehand and things have shifted, which is fantastic. So thank you for that feedback. And then just a kind of yes or no response to this one, please. It's always really important for me to know the answer to this question. And if you have any comments to follow up, then please do send those if there's a way of doing so. I'd be really interested to hear. Okay, so I'll share those with you. And then one final question, if I can grab it up, is more about practice. Okay, so I'm going to close that now because most of you have responded. Now that is absolutely fabulous to see. So I'm really glad to see that. And I'd be really interested to hear how you think things might change your practice. So do let me know in whatever format you think you can. Yeah, and I'll pass back to Fraser now.